Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along and speak to you today in relation to what is quite a difficult subject, I think, to sometimes discuss. And this is about organisational abuse, and particularly in relation to our Safeguarding Adults review in relation to Joanna, John and Ben, who were all inpatients at Cawston Park, which was a privately run hospital here in Norfolk. You know, we've entitled it A Nettle to be Grasped because it is something, it's a particular area of safeguarding that actually is very challenging, is sometimes really uncomfortable and really difficult to talk about and to accept that that does happen. And what we're going to sort of go through is what happened for us, what we have done in relation to moving the recommendations on, and thinking about your role as essentially change agents to be able to challenge cultures and have you know, a really open, transparent culture to move forward. So Safeguarding Adult Reviews, what do they do for us? This is about all of us as professionals, organisations, agencies coming together to look at the lessons that we need to learn and to change practice going forward. So in terms of Safeguarding Adult Reviews, it's a statutory responsibility for boards. I'm the independent chair of the Norfolk board, and I actually took over just as we published this report. And I can remember Walter saying to me when I applied for the post, we've got a tricky Safeguarding Adults review, and it was tricky. So I picked it up as we started. What is it? It is about gathering the facts. It is a statutory requirement, but it's very much a learning vehicle. It's not about blame. You do have to get to the facts without a shadow of a doubt, but it is not about accountability and holding people out to dry. Basically, it is about learning. It's about moving forward and changing our practice, acknowledging that there are some difficulties, and you know, what I think was incredibly valuable, and I've just myself authored a Safeguarding Adult review. It's really important that as independent healthcare providers that you are part and parcel of the review, because you get an awful lot more value out of a review from that perspective. There are other vehicles, obviously, that are taking place generally at the same time. You will have coroner's inquest potentially, or the parallel inquiries, maybe a criminal investigation, a CQC investigation. But you know, this within the Safeguarding Adults review process is about having that open and honest conversation about what needs to change to try and make sure that these sort of issues don't reoccur. The likelihood of them reoccurring is reduced. Walter, are you on now?
Heather, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. There you go.
I am
Do you want to,
I'm sorry.
do you
I
want to
will pick
carry
up
on?
now. I will
Okay, and I'll
indeed.
come back in.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Good morning, colleagues. My sincere apology about not being able to work the technology. Heather, thank you for stepping in and starting the presentation off. So good morning. My name is Walter Lloyd-Smith. It's my real pleasure to join you today on your conference. I'm the manager with the Norfolk Safeguarding Adults Board. So indeed, as Heather was saying, what are SARs for us? I will just add, there are raw material that helps us find and then use opportunities for practice improvement, safeguarding practice improvement within organizations, within partnerships, and across, one would hope, the whole system. And just to finish the sort of the last point there on the slide, indeed, as Heather touched on, there is an important and sometimes sort of tricky negotiation to navigate between the role of Safeguarding Adult Reviews and its interface with other reviews. And Heather mentioned inquests, and there are leader reviews and so on. What is most important is we boards, but our partners approach the review in a frame of a sort of open and honest consideration of what we will gain from that review. And having independent health providers on side is absolutely critical to gaining us the real value of what the Safeguarding Adult Review can give us. If I could have the next slide, please, Phil. Thank you. So, as we said, this is a presentation entitled Grasping a Nettle. It's looking at organizational abuse as identified within the Safeguarding Adult Review that we did for Joanna, John, and Ben. And these are real people with real lives, with real sort of aspirations, wants and needs. They were 3 young adults with complex learning disability needs and other complex health needs, and they were placed at a Norfolk private hospital. Very sadly, and I think in many ways shame to us, that they entered the hospital, but they didn't leave the hospital. They died in that 27-month period. And they arrived to the hospital as a result of personal and sort of family crisis, but this wasn't an easy arrival. I mean, Joanna, for example, as you can see, there were 36 other contacts made before that placement at the hospital was secured. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Joanna and John came from London, and Ben was lived in Norfolk, and he lived most of his life with his mother, and they all shared this point of crisis, which brought them into the care of the hospital. Now, what the review, I think, lays out very strongly for us, and is difficult reading, is how the families experienced that support and service, and they describe, and the review sets out how, in fact, this was their contact and involvement with the hospital was quite indifferent and sometimes harmful. And however hard they tried to raise their concerns and support the care of their loved ones, it didn't receive the attention that it should have done. And their concerns were grouped around, as you can see, concerns around unsafe grouping of certain patients within the hospital at that time, the excessive use of restraint and seclusion by unqualified staff, lot of concern around over medication, and also the experience of their loved ones day to day, and the high tolerance, as I would describe it, and the review describes it, that the hospital had to sort of not doing anything during the day, and that inactivity, which then feeds into other concerns and challenges around their care. So the Safeguarding Adult Review lays bare for us in a very challenging way, some of this really extremely poor care within our Norfolk system. If I could have the next slide, please. So, and again, colleagues, this I'm sure will be familiar for you. What is organizational abuse? What are we talking about here? And helpfully, our statutory guidance on safeguarding sets it out, very clearly for us. And as you can see, it focuses in on neglect and poor care practice within a particular setting, in an institutional or specific care setting. It can present itself as a one-off incident, and we shouldn't forget that. Or more often, we gain an understanding and we start to view events through the lens of organizational abuse by drawing together, a range of perhaps more minor incidents, as they may be described or called, which build an overall picture. And they flow from, and they're a product of poor professional practice that is seated or located within an organizational structure, policy and procedures within the service. So very clear, and very helpful understanding of what organisational abuse is in the statutory guidance. But what does it really sort of look like? Can we put a little bit more detail on this understanding? And here, you know, Heather and I have tried to summarize this for you. And in particular, one of the features that I think is important for us to acknowledge from the SAR for Joanna, John, and Ben is a characteristic for this private hospital to be unable to sustain an acceptable level of care that in fact was breaching Joanna, John, and Ben's human rights, which is incredibly, and I'm sure all would agree, very, very serious. Cawston Park, we see, was unable, you know, or provided very poor physical health care. There were real fundamental problems and difficulties gatekeeping through the hospital into secondary care, and I've mentioned also the issue of sort of over medication. But we also have an understanding that within the service, staff did not see Joanna, John, and Ben as equals, or they were unable to speak up for themselves, and the staff didn't support them do that. We have 3 people here who were visited, perhaps left often, because they were placed many miles, for 2 of them anyway, from their families, from their support networks, and that increased the risks and isolation for them. They stayed for many months, and other patients stayed for many months and even years. I've touched on also this weak relationship between families and staff, and often, you know, families, you know, where we see organizational abuse more widely across other services are portrayed or characterized as sometimes overprotective of their loved ones, or even on occasions sort of hostile. And from that, their concerns, their genuine concerns and worries for their loved ones are not taken seriously. They're not seen as experts with any valid contribution to make. They're marginalized. They're moved to the side where we see features of organizational abuse. We also have to understand a characteristic being weak management, supervision, staff lacking the right skills, training and expertise to support people with complex needs. So if I was trying to summarize that for us, it would be to say, while certainly the example from the Norfolk SAR was a sense across a number of professionals that there were concerns here. They weren't necessarily fully articulated or understood, but there was this undercurrent of unease. A certain reputation was building across the system for the services that were being provided or not being provided. And I think that's really helpful. I mean, one of the participants shared with me during the review that there was a sort of a phrase around, or discussions, that actually the senior leadership within the service were sometimes, in the way they approached their safeguarding roles and responsibilities, viewed as perhaps having the persona of used car salesman. You know, that they were saying all the right words in all the right places, but actually weren't able to support that. There was a merry-go-round of senior leadership. You know, people weren't moved on from the service, they were just moved around the service. And I think this is very helpful because it links very clearly with the work that Kate Spreadbury and Rachel Hubbard have done. And they've noted the work of Marshall and White. So this is work from 2012 that suggests for us that the indicators of organizational abuse cross 6 domains. And in particular, where you see concerns around management and leadership as a significant indicator, the other indicators will soon follow or be present. And these include, as I've said, staff skills, training, knowledge, experience, you know, concerns about the residents' behavior and well-being, the service relying quite heavily on occasions from agency staff, concerns that the service resists the support and input from external bodies or agencies, skilled professionals, and so on. So we've got a number of indicators to help us better and understand more deeply the concerns around, or what organizational abuse looks like. Now, the third point there is on closed cultures, and I'm not going to go into that in any great detail for the presentation this morning, because of time, but also just to acknowledge that there is important work that's been done, particularly by the CQC. And it's just to note really that this does develop in sometimes routine, but often nuanced ways. It's very quite subtle. It's hard to pick up. It's hard to join the dots on occasions to understand that bigger picture. But that bigger picture continues to present itself. We know very well the Winterbourne Review from 2011-12, and it sort of set out the concerns for all safeguarding adult boards and other bodies, including CQC and the Department of Health and Social Care, that these types of services should be considered high risk. So it needs to be on our collective radar, most definitely. Phil, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And thinking specifically about Cawston Park and organizational abuse, how did it present? Well, what we saw was a sort of cyclic picture of response. A safeguarding concern would have been raised positively. There would be a response, there would be a degree of improvement, action, a focus on it. There was over the period of time that the review covered, quite on occasion sustained input from other agencies and support, and some of this was actually on site. That improvement is gained and demonstrated. The support steps back or is stood down, and then the service is unable to maintain this. We then have the same concern raised, and we go through this cyclic process. At Cawston, we did have these features that I just mentioned. People were removed from their communities. Tick. People stayed there for many months or even years. That's a tick. There was no sense, certainly for Joanna, John and Ben and some of the other patients in the care of the hospital, that there was a next step for them. They were just sort of, if you like, suspended in a limbo type of experience. So when we had the value and opportunity to review their care plans, for example, there wasn't a connection with the little that they did during their days was connected to a plan of going forwards. So visit to the shops made, but they didn't understand that was part of a process of skill building or development, to see that as part of a sort of them moving on from the hospital services that they were currently in. There was a sense that people were just there. Weak leadership that I've mentioned, double tick. I've mentioned staff not having the right skills, training, experience. Again, that was reflected at Cawston. And I think from the perspective of the board and sort of safeguarding, the lack of a positive and open engagement between the staff team and the families was absolutely present, and that stands out very, very strongly in the SAR. So there was a characteristic feeling that actually, from the hospital engagement with the review, that there was actually nothing to be seen here, please. We would, please move along, if you like. And an inability to recognize some of these features that have contributed to the experience of Joanna, John and Ben, and ultimately their death. If I could have the next slide, please. We do have to acknowledge, and it is important that we do so, that our system knew a lot. We had a great deal of information coming into safeguarding around concerns. A huge volume and number of concerns raised, as you can see in the table there, with a a significant number progressing to full inquiry under Section 42(2). But this sense that this change that was needed and required to combat and respond to concerns around organizational abuse or individual cases of abuse for individual patients wasn't sustained. I will pay tribute absolutely to the tenacity of key safeguarding staff here over this period, and the work that in particular the safeguarding social worker did. So it posed an important question for us from a board perspective about whether the scale of the safeguarding concerns that were coming in some way normalized or masked or hid the actual overall picture that we needed to understand and appreciate and respond to around organizational abuse. And that, I think, is an important reflection for the board and those working as members of the board to take forward and to think about their roles and responsibilities as the board itself. So if I could have the next slide, please. So just some key findings to talk a little bit more about from the review itself. And I think something that stands out for me personally is an understanding that more work needs to be done around the trauma of transition. As people move into these types of services, we need to have greater and more open discussion about how that is experienced, how that is lived out by the people that may be moved at sometimes very, very short notice, and the consequences that plays into their behavior and their engagement with the new setting that is trying to support them. I mean, Joanna, for example, arrived at Cawston late at night in the dark, having traveled many miles. I think it was on a Friday as well, which is, we know that that's not going to work well, both for her and the staff that are trying to receive and support her. And we need to do more to get that right and understand these issues around transition. Meaningful support for individuals with behaviors that challenge others. All too often, I think, interventions, particularly physical interventions, simply manage the presenting behavior without proper attention being considered to the root causes or the possible triggers. Now, colleagues, you will, I'm sure, appreciate and know that, but as we play it out in practice, as the review tells us here, this was missing. All behaviors, as we know, are forms of communication, and the onus is on us. The onus is on us as practitioners to try and understand what that is telling us and what that means. It's important to note that the SAR identified that staff often didn't recognize some of the self-soothing or employed appropriate diversion techniques when there were situations which were really difficult, challenging from Joanna, John, and Ben. And I think the language that we saw through looking at the material in the review tells us a great deal. That there was many references to sort of describing the behaviors as kicking off, pushing the boundaries, histrionic, tricky, which places the blame on the person without any sort of context. And I think that's a valuable and important lesson that we need to and we must take on board. I think also it's important to just note there that point about meaningful occupation. Joanna, John, and Ben's day was very boring, and there was not a great deal going on for them for very long periods. And I don't know how we would respond if our day didn't have a level of stimulation and engagement within it. It would produce anxiety, feelings of disconnection. And that is really important, that we recognize that how invaluable that is to be occupied. It's an innate part of us as human beings to engage with our environment, to be able to to have meaningful occupation, and those meaningful occupations must be made available to people in the care of specialist services as they would be anywhere else. And we can use them very positively to support that safeguarding, those incidents of safeguarding which may present themselves. We need to make sure absolutely in these services for people like Joanne and John and Ben, we pay proper and appropriate attention to their physical health needs. And that's a very standout feature within the review, how that was missed, marginalized, placed to one side. Mental capacity stands out as a critical part of understanding the safeguarding concerns, and its absence stands loud in the findings that we have in understanding the issues around organizational abuse in this example. There's also important recognition of the active engagement that we had with the Law Commission on law change, and Heather will touch on that in a moment or two. And then finally, that point there around how quality is monitored and developed is also, I think, valuable. If I could have the next slide, please. So, in terms of some sort of key points of learning and reflection on organizational abuse, I would propose that an important one is this sense of a cyclic concern, improvement made, but unable to sustain, and then a decline is seen and is valuable to us to use as a sort of red flag, if you like, where we then can focus and support services that find themselves in that cycle, if you like. We have an important interplay between the different legal duties, and Heather touched on that in earlier in the presentation. And we need to make sure that the role of the safeguarding adult review is complementary when looking at the issues around organizational abuse, but wider than that, with those other processes, whether they're from the local authority, CQC, police, coroners, etc. And it's important that when we participate in reviews, and I include our independent health providers here, there is a clarity about roles and expectations within that process. The review points us towards opportunities to move away from health admissions and social care discharges. And that might be an important learning point or point of action for you to take away from the conference today, about asking or generating some further discussions within your integrated care service about how you might do that, how you might support a better, more joined up, integrated way to support people with high complex needs. And we need to be very diligent and keep a clear line of sight on that we don't just do the review, that we actually follow through and we see that sort of permanent change. We make change more Velcro, sticky, whether it be to individual services, practitioners, or whole partnerships, and less Velcro. We want to see permanent change from the learning that we gain. And if we don't pay that attention, I think we'll see disengagement from the review process, which will be a detriment to everybody working in safeguarding, but most importantly, the people to which we have a responsibility to and a focus on. Thank you, Phil. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass over to Heather, who will look at some of the what's happened since the review has been published. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, Walter. So just in terms of moving the review forward, one of the most important things, and Walter just touched on it at the end there, is it can be a really intense period going through a review, getting it published, lots of media interest. But actually, the really important thing is so what? What happens? What changes? What do we need to do to make sure that this sort of situation doesn't happen again? And I think the board here in Norfolk has taken a really unique approach to doing this. I think sometimes it's about being brave and taking those recommendations to national bodies, and being persistent, quite frankly, about how change needs to happen. So what we've done is we've taken the recommendations. We've got a real commitment. Both locally, and I think nationally as well, and I'll talk through some of those, to try to make sure that this situation like this does never happen again. We have run two formal progress summits over the last 2 years, and we've invited both local and national organisations to report back to us on what they've achieved, and probably most importantly, reporting on what's getting in the way, what's blocking the change, where are the challenges, and where we can all work together to unblock them. So just if we move on to the next slide. So, in terms of locally, where we've been able to make progress, at both of our summits, we've had really positive feedback about how our Norfolk patients that were moved from Cawston Park went into more appropriate settings. It's been really challenging, but actually the progress we've seen there, in individuals living much better lives in more appropriate accommodation has been really encouraging. As I say, it's not necessarily been easy to do that. Um, an ethical commissioning framework has been co-produced, and that's been done with a company called Curators for Change, and that's had a focus on learning difficulties and autism services across the local authority and ICB, and that's about providing a whole system approach to ensuring that the actual service that's delivered is person focused, and that it is, there's a consistency in that monitoring of the providers. What we've also been able to do is establish what we call the Coalition for Change. And this is an independent group of our board. It sits at arm's length from NSAB, and this is made up of experts by experience, experts in delivering service to people who have behaviour that challenges. And the Coalition for Change really has worked as a coordinator across lots of different diverse groups. It's also become very much involved in influencing how service is delivered both locally and influencing nationally. And we hope that that group is going to become self-sustaining as we go forward. The local authority and ICB have also commissioned a review around their LD&A services, which is being completed again by a consultant, Tricordant, and that's about to move into phase 2 of its work. So that's really, we kind of know what the service should look like and feel like, but now it's about, so how do you change it and how do you deliver it? So one of the other recommendations within the review was around tackling racism. And the local authority again has taken a real lead in this, in delivering a real practical policy across both the local authority and the ICB, which really provides advice and support to workers in terms of some real practical advice and support about dealing with issues of racism. One of the things I haven't mentioned on the slide is our own Health Watch colleagues also on the back of the review conducted a programme of visits to listen and to really understand what matters to people who access support. And their findings, really mirror what was in the review. In brief, people wanted lives that they perceived as being equal to people that were non-disabled. They wanted family-like relationships between the residents and the staff. They wanted their wishes heeded and responded to. And they wanted to make sure that staff and managers had got a really good understanding of their needs and preferences, and it's all about their choice. Also about giving them the opportunity and support to develop capabilities and independence, and to really support them in meaningful participation within the community. So again, it mirrors what we were saying within the review. Next slide. So in terms of the national progress, the SAR has been responsible really to ensure that NHS England committed to reviewing over 2,000 patients who were in similar situations to Joanna, John, and Ben, and they were subject with the then CCGs to a really thorough safe and wellbeing review. On the back of the safe and wellbeing reviews, there was a thematic report published earlier this year. Sad to say, really, the key themes are mirrored again within this review that we saw within this within our review. Lack of involvement of families, lack of planning for discharge, weight management issues, and individuals' activity. So lots still to do, particularly in this cohort. At the second Progress Summit, NHS England outlined their quality transformation programme. They talked about really clear outcomes for patients being supported in the community, to promote citizenship and human rights, and involving patient, really improving the patient and staff experiences. And a real commitment as well to services being closer to people's homes. They also published in January this year the NHSE Dynamic Support Register and the policy to support the care and treatment reviews. And the risk register really is about identifying people who may be at risk of admission to hospital. And the CTR policy is around that additional support and challenge. The CQC reported back to us that their registration and inspection programme had also been strengthened. There's a real emphasis now on listening to individuals and families about their experience. And there is, in terms of registration, much stricter application of the criteria for the development of new services. So I think, we should be really pleased that so much progress has been made. And I go back to saying, be brave and take the recommendations to those national bodies that can make the change. Next slide. Thank you. So what's still to be done? We've had several discussions as a board now with the Law Commission and the prospect of a legislation change to amend the law around corporate criminal liability. It's very much focused around property and fraud, as opposed to services that are delivered to people. Sadly, at the moment, it's not included within the, I think it's the 14th programme of law reform, but they have committed to keeping it on their agenda. Very simply, what they have to get is almost sponsored, if you like, and that really needs to come from the Department of Health and Social Care. So that's what we've been trying to get on the board, and being able to ensure that we never sort of lose this, and we keep going back to it and talking about, how might we make those improvements, whether it's through criminal legislation or whether it's through regulation. The Department for Health and Social Care, they reported back to us that they have really committed to making it easier for people with LD and autistic people to be discharged from hospital. They have committed through the NHS long-term plan about halving the number of inpatients within mental health hospitals, and they have, as you're probably aware, published a draft a change to the mental health bill on the 27th of June last year. We mentioned deprivation of liberties and the introduction of liberty protection safeguards. You will know that has been delayed, and potentially LPS will not come into fruition until we get into another parliament. So really, building on what needs to happen to really make a huge difference to people in the same situation as John, Joanna, and Ben, is this real investment in community alternatives to inpatient care. People will always have a crisis and will need some intervention, but actually a system which focuses around individuals having choice, being close to home, having a much better support network around them, um, must lead ultimately to better outcomes, more tailored accommodation at the end of the day. But it all comes down to cost, availability, the services being there for them. But I think actually, if you looked at how far we've come in the last 2 years, I think this review has made a significant impact, but we must never lose the legacy of what is John, Joanna, and Ben. Back to you, I think, Walter, for the last few slides.
Thank you, Heather. So I'm mindful of the time, but I wanted to take the opportunity to share just a few reflections for colleagues about being part of the safeguarding ecosystem. So if I could, Phil, you could have the next slide, please. So a few thoughts here. What happens when you get asked to participate in a safeguarding sort of adult review? Well, I'm sure there's a range of thoughts and responses and feelings about it. I would just perhaps reflect that it might feel like a bit of a shock to yourselves, or to your organization, to the system that you are part of, to the relationships that you currently have, and potentially reflections on whether that's a challenge to established relationships. I would encourage you to recognize that, to acknowledge it, but also to step through it or beyond it, and see the opportunity for participating in a review as a real critical moment to help shape and improve the safeguarding systems that you are part of, and that you contribute to. Use the challenge. And it will be a challenge at times. I would like to believe, and certainly our approach here in Norfolk is, yes, we ask challenging questions, but we do them respectfully and professionally. But nevertheless, we don't step back from some of those maybe difficult questions, because we are trying to keep absolutely a focus on the opportunities to find learning, to stay on the right side of the line, between learning and apportioning or giving blame in the circumstances in which we're looking at. We need to be very clear and maintain that focus on why we are there. We are there to create a space for us as a system and as partners, and including providers, statutory and non-statutory, that allow us the opportunity to say, this didn't work well, clearly. And so therefore, what do we need to do to change? This challenge is important to be acknowledged, that it will take time, that it needs a commitment from organizations' leadership, their senior leadership, but throughout the organization, but particularly at the top. Taking it as an opportunity to positively look for opportunities to improve. It's really important, and a reflection that I've had since we conducted the review for Joanna, John, and Ben, is always be mindful to make sure that key colleagues don't partially engage or even withdraw. I take a view that, and I approach the work of a safeguarding adult review in a way that may have some challenge, but it's also about accountability. But it's reminding us about those underlying aims of what the SAR is here to do. So if I could have the next slide, please. And here I just want to take a few minutes to share some of the work around change agents and change agency, because I think this is really helpful for us when we're thinking about reviews that are looking at challenging topics, reviews that are looking, in this case, at the issues of organizational abuse. And here I want to make reference to the work of Dr. Helen Bevan. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Bevan's work and the idea of, as I say, change agencies. Dr. Bevan is the Chief Transformation Officer at NHS Horizons. She's a senior leader within the national system that's led change across the English NHS for more than 20 years, and she's been at the forefront of changes and initiatives that have made a substantive and clear difference to thousands of patients in that time. In terms of change agents, each and every one of you are that. And I think a positive reflection, an acknowledgement that you're change agents positively around adult safeguarding is the very fact that you've taken time to join this event today out of diaries which I know will be busy and pressured, and I applaud you, for that. That's a very positive signal that you're giving around being a change agent. And throughout the rest of the event today, I'd encourage you to actively listen, look for those takeaway messages so you can improve the work that your organizations do to protect those at greatest risk. And change agency is us as agents using that power, whether it's individually within teams, with individual cases, or more collectively to drive the systems of improvement that we need around adult safeguarding. So it's seeking out positive opportunity to mobilize others. Yes, push the boundaries. Say that this isn't acceptable. We want to do better. We must do better. It's incumbent upon us to do better, in the memory of Joanna, John, and Ben. If I could have the next slide, please. And from that, we need to encourage the opportunity to support a culture of openness. As I mentioned in passing, closed cultures and what they are and how they present is well understood. But I would encourage you to take opportunities to be proactive from your organization, from your role as safeguarding change agents. Don't wait to be asked by your SAB. Seek out opportunities to engage. Remember, and the experience that we had here in Norfolk about a sort of, on occasions, that wall of silence or that half-hearted partial engagement only increased our focus, only increased the questions, only increased our determination to make sure that we gained a full understanding, and we did right by Joanna, John, and Ben. It is your reputation as a partner and as part of a safeguarding ecosystem that it will be identified or recognized in such a way if you don't seek that positive stance and move into the review in a way that says, yes, we recognize here that there may have been difficulties, there may have been something gone seriously wrong, but we want to do the right thing. We want to do better, and an opportunity to develop from today, strengthen any buddying systems of support that are there. Certainly, the Independent Health Provider Safeguarding Forum could act as an active catalyst to doing that, and I know that that's things that they've been doing in the past. So I would commend that and encourage you to seek out opportunities to work together as organizations to strengthen your involvement in safeguarding adult review and more widely safeguarding adult work. Next slide, please. So in terms of delivering that meaningful legacy, the meaningful legacy for Joanna, John, and Ben, and the many hundreds of individuals like them who need that very high level support, and in some circumstances within a hospital setting, we need to strengthen the approach to better articulate those undercurrents of concerns. We need to gather that evidence that helps us understand what those concerns are. But also, there's an opportunity for you to look at your own internal system, how well it picks up intelligence within the organization. How well are you responding to that? How open are you being? How transparent is the opportunities that you've taken to say, this hasn't quite worked, abuse and harm has occurred, and actively engage locally with other partners, in particular the local authority. national and local engagement is absolutely necessary to hold agencies to account. We need to make sure that that is understood when we carry out a review, that, as I say, it's not about blame, but it's about accountability. It's about saying we need to improve. One of the, I think, developing opportunities that we will see, developing changes that will come to us as we develop our review methodology, we grow our confidence around it, is supporting the opportunity, the development of regulation that has a bit more bite, and I say that in a positive way, to hold and maintain organizations to account for what they're asked to do. But I finish perhaps with one of the most points that stayed with me around maintaining contact with the families, through the review process. They are an integral part of what we do when we're required to carry out a safeguarding adult review, but that extends, I believe, after publication. And it's certainly something that we've tried to do following the publication of the SAR for Joanna, John, and Ben. And if I could just have the next slide, please, is to finish by saying, it's yes, learning from our mistakes, increasing our knowledge, but I believe that what we've seen and been able to implement using the review for Joanna, John, and Ben, it's not how we make those mistakes, but it's how we correct them that defines us. So thank you very much for your attention and time and listening today. I think, Phil, we might have overrun a bit, and I do apologize for that. Partly my inability to work the technology, but there may be an opportunity for a few questions, possibly. I don't know. I'll put the link to the report, the practitioner review, the 7-minute guide in the chat as people may have a question or two. Thank you.
Walter and Heather, thank you so much for the time you spent with us this morning. The amount of kind of love hearts and round of applause and everything kind of coming through the chat is a little bit overwhelming on my very busy screen, but it is testament to the sharing of the learning. And there was a question put in the chat, which Heather, you kindly answered, but I think the answer just went to us as panelists instead of the wider group around finding the space for the SAR. So I wondered if you wanted just to answer that quickly, just for everybody.
Thank you. That's my inability with technology. Sorry about that. Yeah, just in terms of, there's a question around finding the space for the safeguarding adult review when there's lots of other processes going on. And I think most people will appreciate that where there is a criminal investigation, then that takes precedence, and then following on from anything criminal, you look at your other processes. There's always in those instances there will be a coroner's inquest, and potentially a CQC investigation, but that's a potential. The SAR really is very much around learning, and that's how we are really keen to make sure that we have that fine balance between individuals being able to be open and honest, and organisations admitting where things have not gone right. And there's that fine balance between, well, okay, if I talk to you about the SAR, what about the coroner's inquest? What about the CQC? So we do very much try to make sure that this is about the review, and not any other process. I mean, obviously, if something was disclosed that affected a criminal case, then that would have to be reported in. But we do try and make sure that the SAR is focused on learning. And just as for instance, I've recently done a different SAR, and I had an agreement with the CQC. I could ask them for information; they would not come to us and to me as a SAR author for information. So it kind of kept that confidentiality, and you need the confidence of people to be able to get the real learning out.
Thank you, Heather. And I think there are a couple of chats which have come through in the Q&A, and just want to reflect for a moment. And we definitely have overrun, but for all of the right reasons, not the technology reasons. It's important to give that space to reflect on the learning from the sad deaths of Joanna, John, and Ben. And I know, obviously, I wasn't involved, but I'm fortunate enough to have spent time with Norfolk colleagues, and kind of personally wanted to say thank you for the SAR. And I know it wasn't easy. There are a number of colleagues who spent time directly in the service. There were colleagues from multiple different teams, not just from the local authority, but from the commissioners, from a whole range of different services. And if we can take anything from it, we do need to recognise this morning that the learning spans much wider than Norfolk. It spans much wider than autism, learning disability, complex and challenging behaviour services. And I mean, for example, the briefing on racism, you mentioned that challenge highlighted in the SAR about racism towards staff from the service user group. That briefing prepared by the Norfolk SAB is something that I sadly find myself signposting colleagues to across the sector quite regularly. And you also reflected on the National Safe and Wellbeing Reviews, and whilst it'd be easy to look at the headlines from that, if we say, for example, like, I think it was only 3%, so something like 50 out of close to 2,000, 1,700 odd reviews resulted in a safeguarding concern being raised. But the other learning you highlighted, the inactivity, the poor attention to physical health, and all those other areas are much bigger than just that safeguarding lens, and form that foundation of a potential safeguarding lens. So for colleagues who are kind of attendees and kind of listening in, if you haven't already read the summary and the findings from the Safe and Wellbeing Reviews, I would definitely recommend it. And what I'm going to do is just to bring in a couple of points that we were hoping to kind of fit in before lunch. And Heather and Walter, please do kind of stay for this, because it'd be really valuable to get your thoughts. One of the things I was going to ask, if I had time to go through the whole presentation, was that question of, as a sector, can we get it right? We deal with some really tricky numbers. There are 317 local authorities, 132 safeguarding adults boards, 42 integrated care systems, which are condensed to 106 clinical commissioning groups, 217 plus kind of NHS trusts. There are a lot of people with opinions on how safeguarding should be done. And we know, despite the fact that safeguarding is written in black and white in both the legislation, the statutory guidance, safeguarding accountability and assurance framework for our NHS providers and those with an NHS contract, Schedule 32 of the NHS contract, that when we do safeguarding right, we normally have to kind of navigate the grey area created by the black and white. And we do that because we're supporting individuals in individual situations. So there's different expectations placed a challenge. We've got challenging service user groups with significant risks. We've got a positive obligation to intervene using physical force where the risks necessitate it. And that's again set out in black and white legislation. And we constantly balance this fine line between an expectation to provide the least restrictive environments and least restrictive practice with a duty to prevent harm at the same time. We've got all of those different stakeholders, all of those tricky numbers with very strong opinions on how services should be run. And it could be down to a lack of understanding of what observations achieve. And again, that's something that the Cawston Park Safeguarding Adults Review highlighted, the kind of the understanding of close observations for service users. So it's a really tricky landscape and it's a really tricky balancing act. And at its core, everyone wants the same thing, and that's to support people and to empower them and to keep them safe. So a couple of kind of quotes I shared recently at Nursing Live in Liverpool was that if you do right, no one remembers. And if you do wrong, no one forgets. And if we put it really bluntly, safeguarding won't necessarily make a service, but it will break a service. So some of the suggestions that I have for colleagues is that having held especially national safeguarding roles for a number of years now, some of these things are absolutely crucial. And I'd suggest that people map their stakeholders, and that could be everyone from the tissue viability nurse who visits once a month all the way through to the commissioners and everyone in between. But the most important stakeholders are the people you support. And reflecting on Cawston Park, their families, their carers, the people who love them and the people who they love. Need to build better relationships with all of those stakeholders. Need to increase the understanding that those stakeholders have of your services, your service lines, your security levels, the purpose of observations, the reason why you're doing things and what you're trying to achieve. involve those stakeholders in decisions about risk, positive risk taking, share the weight of those decisions, and proactively communicate where it hasn't gone as planned, because we shouldn't be marking our own homework. We can't consume our own smoke. And that duty of candor means that colleagues, services, managers need to be open, honest, and transparent. And crucially, it's about getting a foot through the door and a seat at the table, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And thankfully, as you've highlighted, Heather and Walter, the independent sector and mental health services, autism, LD services aren't statutory partners. And kindly, you've suggested that we almost have our own table now with the Independent Health Providers Forum. But crucially, like, when you can't do right for doing wrong, you need to do the right thing. And as we'd always advise our colleagues, we need to remember to document it. Because if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So from a SAB point of view, is there anything, because I know there's the National SAB Chairs Network and the Board Managers Network, just for our colleagues watching, is there anything going on at the moment which perhaps may drive a bit more kind of forward positive engagement with our sorts of services that we can perhaps share this morning?
I'll share a few. Thank you, Phil. That was really helpful to hear your thoughts. I would. This is not me. This is a very good leader here in Kenny Gibson, who you talked about a seat at the table, and Kenny reminds us, doesn't he? If you don't have a chair, a seat at the table, bring your own chair. And I think I'd encourage colleagues from the organisation, from independent health providers, to be on the front foot, to go, oh, do I know my board manager? Could I make contact with my board chair? Start a discussion about how the independent sector or providers are represented at that strategic level. And I think you say, what's positively sort of going forwards. I think safeguarding adult boards, in my experience, and the sort of discussions that I'm grateful for, I think there's a growing maturity now that after a number of years, we're really starting to see that leadership start to embed. So you do need to be part of that strategic conversation, or there may be other ways in which you can offer expertise and support to a board's activities. So it might be, maybe it might not be at the board level, but it might be in one of their work streams, for example, or it might be, in supporting a particular piece of work, sharing some of the heavy lifting on occasions, which is a strong signal that you want to be engaged, and you want to be part of this safeguarding ecosystem. You don't stand outside of it, or you don't have a foot half in it. You're showing that absolutely all of the things that you just touched on there, Phil, very skillfully, are part and parcel. They're demonstrated in a very practical way. So I would say the conversation at boards is deepening in its nature, and it's coming from a point of growing confidence. And with that deepening conversation comes, yes, more hard questions, but hard questions that are important, because, as you say, we need to do right by the people that we serve. We need to absolutely, where we can, prevent abuse and harm happening. And if it has happened, we need to respond to it, in a open, transparent way. And where things haven't gone well, we hold our hands up and we look for the opportunities to change. I always remember working as a safeguarding practitioner, in that those services that said to me, everything is fine here, we are such a good service that we don't have any concerns around safeguarding, were the services that got more of my attention. Because the services that raised those concerns, the services that said, actually, no, this does need to be reported out, we do need to engage with the local authority and others when needed, had confidence in that they were working in a way that protected. So I don't know if Heather wants to share any reflections around from a safeguarding chair perspective.
I think it's a fair challenge, actually, Phil. And both Walter and I sit on our national execs or board managers and the SAB chairs network, and it's something that we can have a discussion about, really, because it is about how we engage with each other. And not in relation to this review, but I've just recently had a review published, and one of the recommendations that I made in there, and it relates to when we went through the pandemic in a particular area, that care providers were not seen as really key stakeholders and weren't part of the decision making. And I think it's really key that when we get into any sort of situation where healthcare providers are impacted on, they should have a say in how it happens and be part of that response and be part of the strategic decision making. So I think it's a fair challenge, and actually it's something that I can certainly take away and discuss with our national network, and hopefully bear some fruit from there.